Mark Levin continues to push the concept of having a convention of states. Recently, this week, he had the head of the Constitution of States organization that's attempting to get this through. In case you're not familiar with it, it's a portion of our Constitution that allows when enough states get together and call for a convention, states come together and theoretically propose new amendments to the Constitution, and then one way or the other, it ends up going through the process of amending the Constitution by the same structure that's in place for any other proposed amendment. And first and foremost, Mark Levin is probably close to one of the better experts on the Constitution out there. He does have a few blind spots that are typical of boomer cons, but all in all, his understanding of the Constitution is very solid. Where I have disagreement with him is I don't think he think he's following a flawed version of history in terms of how the Constitution came into being. And this is very understandable. I mean, if you're a constitutionalist and you love the Constitution, you have a tendency to buy the mythological perfect birth story that comes with a nation. And in this case, as with most birth myths of nations, there's a tendency to focus on all the good stuff that happened and kind of ignore the bad stuff. And if you don't fully embrace the history that's going on with it, you have trouble seeing why a convention of states could be problematic. And the main term that comes into place here is something called the Runaway Convention. The Convention of States people will tell you there was no runaway convention. It never happened, and it never can happen. So, let's talk about that. So, to understand what was going on at the time of when the U.S. Constitution was put into motion, you got to recall that the state of governance at the time was something called the Articles of Confederation, which was our functioning constitution at the time. What the Federalists, if you only hear their side of the story, is you assume that the Articles of Confederation weren't working, that it was widely recognized that they weren't working, that they were unpopular, and that people were clamoring for some sort of replacement, and thus when the Constitution came on, it was generally a pretty popular thing, and yea, verily, we get a new nation. This is inaccurate. This is essentially the old story of victors writing the history books. In this case, there was a political war. The Federalists won, the Anti-Federalists lost. The Federalists wrote the history, and you have to understand their reasoning. I mean, if they wrote the history exactly the way it happened, it's not a very nice birth story. So, let's walk through it. So, the Articles of Confederation came about, and essentially it was our wartime government for the Revolution. We had a situation where the establishment essentially fractured. A part of the establishment wanted to stay with England as it was. Some of the establishment wanted to create a national government that would, were known as the Unionists, that wanted to create a government that encompassed the whole of the 12 and 13 colonies at that time and subordinate it directly under the king, and that there would be an American parliament that ran the country directly under the King of England. And then, of course, there was the final part of the establishment that decided that breaking from Britain was the goal to have. And the way this final faction was able to make it happen was by allying with essentially the second tier politicians, the ones who were wannabes but weren't quite in the establishment, and essentially a lot of rural people who had been chafing against the Eastern establishment for some time. And this made a functional alliance that allowed for the Revolutionary War to occur, the Articles of Confederation to be signed and essentially followed. And then once the war was over, the establishment ended up coming back together. Interestingly, most history talks a lot about how all the Tories going to Canada, when in fact a lot of them actually came back, and the establishment, pretty much made up with them, said, "Hey, you're still part of us." The Unionists never went away, and their dreams of a central government controlling all the states never went away. And at this point, the part of the establishment that had backed revolution were no longer enthused with being allied to the rural people and the second tier politicos. So we get into a situation where the establishment favored a government system other than the one they had. Okay? And to understand what was going on at the time, in general, things were going relatively well. The population was mostly ignorant about how their government system worked, and for the most part, favored the status quo. For them, they were functioning under their state governments. They felt they were being well represented. For the most part, economics was going well. They felt a great sense of pride of being part of the victory over Great Britain. So there wasn't a clamor for change as much as just that they were happy with the way things were. Maybe not ecstatic, but they weren't looking for an alternative. There were some huge problems with the Articles of Confederation. Not quite as bad as the Federalists will have you believe, and we'll probably do another video on that someday. But the thing is, people recognize that, yep, there's some fixes that need to occur. And well-intentioned second-tier politicos called for a meeting to amend the constitution of the existing government. Now, one of the things that these guys didn't fully understand is that the other part of the establishment had been meeting secretly in other locations, talking about the very idea of setting up a whole new government. And initially, they weren't gaining any headway because we had one thing going on at the time that's unlike anything we have today, which was in the person of George Washington. George Washington had such incredible clout that whatever he said was essentially the way the nation would tend to go. His stature was increased even more so when he essentially refused to become dictator of the new country. Now, Washington was approached by the establishment saying, hey, we want to set up this new government. And Washington, being the incredible gentleman he was, refused. He said, I don't want anything to do with this because I don't want to be the one who destroys the old government and sets up a new one. And a bunch of circumstances occurred that eventually convinced him, and these circumstances were somewhat fabricated, but convinced Washington that he needed to throw his weight behind this new government idea. If Washington hadn't backed the new government, it probably never would have been able to go through. So to a certain extent, that is a relatively unique part of that period. So this convention in Philadelphia comes up with the idea of amending the Articles of Confederation to make it more functional. The establishment ends up overpowering the second-tier politicos and took over the meeting to change the Constitution, pretty much from the beginning. Discussions of amendment of the old Constitution immediately fell to the wayside. They used the fact that Washington was on their side as a methodology of ramrodding this new government idea through. A bunch of the delegates who were attending this convention left in disgust at this. Interestingly, if you look at the signers of the convention, very, very few of the ones who ultimately signed the final document had actually been there for the entire proceeding. Some of the people who came there at the beginning weren't there for the entire thing. Only a handful who started at the beginning were there at the end, and you had people coming and going all throughout. So this meeting to amend the old Constitution became a meeting to write a whole new Constitution. So the establishment proposed a new government using adoption methods that were illegal in the new Constitution. The Articles of Confederation required, in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, that every state legislature had to approve the amendment before it came into effect. The other part of the Articles of Confederation is that the Articles of Confederation were considered to be permanently in effect. They didn't have any ability to dissolve the union that they created. The only way to alter that government was to amend it by all the state legislatures. So essentially, the writing of the new Constitution, they decided that, well, instead of all the states having to sign on to this, only 3/4 of them do. And if we sign this new Constitution into effect, it will dissolve the old Constitution. So essentially, the methodology for adoption is actually illegal by the rules of the old Constitution. So this group meeting in Philadelphia essentially created a method that was not legal to dispose the old government. Once this new Constitution was written, the establishment used their control of media to influence the population to adopt their new government. Overwhelmingly, the major form of media at the time was newspapers, and the overwhelming majority of the newspapers were controlled by people who were Federalists. The establishment then colluded with various interests to create support in the populace. The most notable group was known as the mechanics. These were young men, primarily in the big cities, who were looking for, they did not want an agricultural future for the United States. They wanted an industrial future. And they were sold on the idea that a new central government would pass the kind of laws needed to make a more industrial nation, which these people favored. And they worked very vigorously on behalf of the Federalists. They essentially became the muscle that made things work. They became the workers that put it all together. So a combination of media control, better organization, targeted, motivated groups, and influencing key politicians narrowly pushed this measure over the finish line. Essentially what happens is each state set up their own conventions. Some of them were occurring simultaneously, and interestingly, at the speed word traveled, some conventions were over or basically the results occurred in some states before it was even known in the other states. The key player in setting up uh, the state, one of the first and key state conventions would have been the one in Massachusetts. Uh, the convention was pretty much split down the middle. The Federalists had the advantage in that the meeting was held uh, in an urban center, so all the rural people, delegates who came to this meeting, were at a disadvantage. The longer the meeting went on, the longer they were away from their means of making money. They had limited money to stay there, and a lot of pressure was put on these people to alter their votes based on the fact that if they essentially agreed to things, the meeting would be over faster. The rich merchants of Boston made accommodations, saying, "Hey, if this gets passed, we'll pay for your lodging and everything else that's here." And ultimately, the key figure in Massachusetts was John Hancock. John Hancock initially made no mention of which way he went on things. At the time, they suspected that Virginia was not going to adopt the new Constitution. And essentially, the Federalist approached Hancock and said, well, obviously, if Virginia joins the Union, Washington will end up being the new president of this country. However, since it looks like Virginia isn't going to sign up on this, the most obvious choice for president would be John Hancock. And this convinced John Hancock to essentially use his influence to push this over the edge and win in Massachusetts. Once this occurs, several other states end up following in suit. But the outcome was always very close in a lot of the states. So the states that ended up having reservations on the whole thing are now isolated. If other states have joined up with this, and the ones who are left out feel like they're going to be left behind, they don't want to be little satellites around this big country that's forming up. So they ultimately feel pressure to join. Throughout this, a lot of people were a lot of the delegates, a lot of the politicians were attempting to get some kind of concessions, saying, hey, this new constitution you've thrown up here has a lot of good points, but we see some problems with it. Can we have concessions? And essentially, no compromise was allowed. The Federalist position was take it or leave it. And one of the biggest things that was being asked for from the anti-Federalist side was the Bill of Rights. And we'll talk a little bit about the whole Bill of Rights at the very end of this. So, the question comes is, are there any parallels? And so that's a runaway convention. Convention was started to amend their existing constitution. A new constitution was proposed, and rules that had nothing to do with the old constitution were proposed in order to pass it, and it ends up getting passed. That's a runaway convention. So, could this convention of states turn into another runaway convention? Well, let's see. What happened in Articles of Confederation U.S. that are true today in constitutional U.S.? Well, what about the establishment? The establishment back then favored a government system other than the one they had. Do we think the establishment is firmly behind our existing constitution? Or do you think perhaps they favor a completely different form of government? The answer to that is kind of critical. Okay, the populace was mostly ignorant about their government system and for the most part favored the status quo. Well, um, I would say that's pretty much accurate today, too. Most Americans don't understand how their government works. You have extremes on both sides, where one side is adamantly opposed to the current system and some dramatically for it. But I would say, for the most part, if you lump the ambivalent people and the anti people together, they're probably a super majority at least. So, well intentioned second tier politicals call for a meeting to amend the constitution of the existing government. Well, we got people like Mark Levin and a bunch of various conservative senators and reps and people down at lower levels of government calling for this convention in order to amend the Constitution. Are these the people who actually are the levers of power, or are they wannabes? Are they people who are like, well, we're going to use the power of government to make things work the way we want? Are they the ones really in control? And my answer is no. I don't think they are. Okay. So then, in the middle of this convention, the establishment proposed a new government using adoption methods that were illegal in the old Constitution. Could that happen? Could it happen that somehow a majority takes over this new convention of states, and says, "Hey, there's a lot of things that people want. They want universal health care, and they want common sense gun control, and nobody likes hate speech and all this other." You think that they can't come up with a majority to overwhelm this convention and come up with a majority vote? Well, of course, the people who are in the minority and say, no, 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 we don't want a new constitution, they could storm and leave. That's exactly what happened at the Constitutional Convention. It didn't help. Could they come up and say, hey, you know what the fair thing to do? We'll do things fairly. What we'll do is we'll have a vote in every state. We'll have a plebiscite. Each state will vote and say yay or nay on our new constitution for universal health care and common sense gun control and no hate speech. Do you think you might be able to get people to say, well, that sounds fair? It's a vote. I mean, it's like, what allegiance do we hold to this old Constitution that we really don't understand all that well, and we don't know, the benefits it's been giving us. We just know there's some problems out there, and now they're offering us what sounds like a very legitimate offer. You can vote on this. Well, isn't that fair? Isn't that what everybody wants? It's a democracy, after all. And yes, I damn well know this is meant to be a republic, but most of the population doesn't know that. So imagine that they throw out this idea of, hey, we'll have a plebiscite in every state over our new fabulous constitution that, common sense gun control, no hate speech, uh, universal health care, yeah, all that good stuff. And so, do you think that, okay, so this is what happened in the old when the old Constitution came up for to be run? The establishment used their control of media to influence the population to adopt the new government. Wow. Do you think there's any chance at all that if a majority of people walked out of this convention saying, hey, we got a new constitution here, and we're going to let people vote on it, hey, media, tell us what you think about this, or more accurately, tell us what the people should think about this? You really think there's going to be enough balanced media to defeat this? Media is going to be destroying the old Constitution at this point. They are going to be making this out to be the greatest thing ever. It's the smartest thing that ever came up. People who get their primary information from mainstream media will see no other position than the smartest thing in the world to do is vote yes on this new Constitution. Do you think the establishment will be able to find interests within the country that they can collude with to help make this flow better? You don't, like, virtually all the social media out there, you don't think they're going to jump right on board and go, oh, well, every time somebody says, talks about this new Constitution being a problem, well, we'll just suppress them. Yeah, because that's never happened before, has it? We'll just make it hard for people to find it. We'll just call it disinformation. Because, well-reasoned thinking people really need to look at this and think about whether they need to vote on this or not. And yes seems to be the way to go, because, the old Constitution, it's been around a long time and it's got some weird stuff in it that don't really fit. And all these new ideas we put in there, they're pretty popular and they'll help everybody out, won't they? So, the Philadelphia Convention ended up being a combination of media, better organization, targeted, motivated groups influencing key politicians, narrowly pushing the measure over the finish line. So the question here is, are the conservatives, who quite frankly are horrible organizers and have been for a long time, are they going to have superior organizational skills to be able to defeat a newly proposed constitution that's essentially being shouted from the rooftops and mountaintops by media and pretty much every pretty politician that they can put in front of a camera? I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of faith. Yeah, I think Mark Levin's a smart guy, but he's not going to be able to get his message out to even something looking close to a majority. And even if even the people he can reach out to, he's not going to be able to turn all of them into supporting the original Constitution and running away, fleeing from this new proposed Constitution. So what ends up happening when the East Coast and the West Coast all approve this new Constitution and say, well, here we are, the middle states are going to be under a lot of pressure to join up with this new monstrosity. Yeah, there'll be some holdouts, but there were holdouts under the old system too. When the Philadelphia Convention was done, the state ratifying conventions had come up with a majority. There were a handful of states who were holdouts, and they all eventually capitulated. And then, in the end, the new government was thrust through with no compromise, take it or leave it. I can see that part of history very, very easily repeating itself. So, these are the points I don't think the Convention of States people are answering. Their denial of a runaway convention at Philadelphia doesn't make it go away. It happened. The question they need to be answering is, if it starts to happen again, what is their plan B? If their plan B is, we're going to shake our heads violently going, no, 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 this isn't happening because it didn't happen before because we refuse to believe it, that's not a plan B. So I want to end this by describing how the attempt at a convention of states almost happened almost immediately after the Constitution was signed, and how it was shut down very rapidly, and why. So we've just finished. So basically, the new Congress is meeting after the Constitution's been signed, and the situation arose where anti-federalists were agitating and organizing to utilize the Constitution to call for a convention of states in order, their stated purpose was to pass a Bill of Rights. However, it became known to Madison, the primary author of the Constitution, that a lot of other people were thinking, hey, if we get this Convention of States going, what stops us from turning it into a new runaway convention where we can come up with yet a new government to put in place? Madison immediately saw the threat, and he went to Congress and talked to various people saying, hey, we need to derail this. We need to stop a convention of states from happening. And the best way to do that is to pass a Bill of Rights. He convinced enough congressmen to jump on board. They drafted a Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights eventually gets passed, and it ends up derailing the momentum for creating a convention of states. So if Madison, who is the primary author of the Constitution, gravely feared a convention of states so much that he was willing to cave in on something that he didn't think was necessary at the time in order to stop a convention of states, it says a lot about the potential for mischief that he saw. And if the potential for mischief existed then, why doesn't it exist now? These are questions that supporters of the Convention of States need to answer. So what do you think? Do you think a Convention of States could be held? Do you think the conservatives are well enough organized to prevent something bad from happening? Comment below. Tell me what you think. Do you like the idea of a Convention of States, or should it be something we should be very wary of? Please smash the like button. If you came by this happenstance, please consider subscribing to my channel. And if you know someone who might find this information interesting, please share it with them.